Hey reader, welcome back to the channel, and today we are continuing with part 5 of our transport series, looking at the cover approach to transports. This is also kind of a bittersweet one because it's also the last time we're going to be looking at beloved transport models. The last two actually only involve infantry sections and some officer sections, stuff like that. So they won't actually involve any of the actual transport models. So today we're pulling out all the stops and we're bringing out all of the fun transports, well, some of the fun transports that I own in my collection that I haven't shown you yet. Some of the other ones just don't have paint on them yet, so I didn't do that. And the paint on a lot of these is really rough because I haven't taken most of these to tournaments. But the cover approach, in terms of where we are, we've already talked about large numbers of models, especially split between multiple different squads in one transport, so you can get kind of force concentration, right? Large amounts of activations in a single spot. We've talked about one big squad, sometimes accompanied by an officer, just for morale bonuses and snap 2 benefits and things like that, that can drop into a place and hold that position. We've talked about small tactical assets dropped off to accomplish a specific task. And we've talked about just taking transports as a means of getting easy firepower, relatively cheap access to machine guns and sometimes even heavy weapons to provide you with cover fire that would be a whole lot more expensive if you had to pay for it on a more durable chassis or with multiple infantry attached to it as you would in an artillery section. And so today, when we look at cover transports, I'm not going to lie, this is probably the bravest transport that you're going to have because cover transports are literally just transports that you're taking as mobile cover. They can transport troops. The Landwasserschlepper that you see there for Germany has a transport capacity of 20. This thing is freaking massive. You can block off a whole city street and more with this one thing. You can easily cover a 10 to 12 man rifle section with plenty of cover to spare while still being spread out to avoid potential danger to them with HE. Because this thing is just so massive, okay? And that's kind of the point, right, behind these. The goal behind cover theory is, yes, provide the threat of being able to shoot at people and get people up, right? Because some of these you can take guns on, obviously. So some of them can double as gun trucks, so to speak. But the primary thing that we're considering is we want it to be cover where the table didn't give us cover, right? Because there's known knowns, known unknowns, unknown knowns, and unknown unknowns in games. Okay, this kind of grid is often used by psychologists and stuff like that, as well as strategy trainers for business and things like that. But known knowns are things like the rules. If they release a tournament pack to you and you're going to a tournament, then there's a known. There is information, there is a known answer that can be found, and you have a way to get it, right? You can actually know that. And that is, things like the rules, right? And then you have things like the known unknowns, which is really what we're talking about here, which is we know we're going to be playing on boards. We know that there's going to be a setting, there's going to be a table surface that we're going to be on, but we don't really know in advance what that's going to look like, right? We don't know if it's going to be really open and we're fighting on the outskirts of El Alamein, or whether we're going to be in a place that may have like some larger areas, but some more open areas, like say, farm fields in France, or whether we're going to be playing in a really tight, lots of terrain everywhere. It really doesn't benefit you to take anything with a longer range than a submachine gun, sort of things like a jungle board attacking, say, Tarawa, right? Or something like that. Because we don't know what that is, some people's theories are going to be, well, if I can take a 40-point transport that is very large and it could transport men. So my opponent has the psychological warfare trying to think through, okay, he could just jump guys in there and then I got to be ready for him to come in and attack. That could be really dangerous. But all the while, it's also just literally fulfilling the role of, well, here's some soft cover or here's some hard cover for my guys. It's already doing its job. And your opponent can't really do much about it, right? This is kind of the beauty of it, because damage value 6 vehicles and damage value 3 tows, and as much as you get damage value 3 tows and other vehicles, they all count as soft cover. That's a 5+ save, 6+ save for cavalry. Anything that's damage value 7+, if you just pay a couple more points, typically it's about 10 to 20 points to bump something up instead to a damage value 7+ vehicle, now it counts as hard cover. And so now you're getting a 4+ save for all of your guys, 5+ save for cavalry, and of course a +1 in case you've got infiltrators that are using this thing for cover, right? So because of that, Viola, we have ourselves a a very mobile way of being able to say about half to a third of all the shots that are coming toward this unit that would have wounded somebody, no go, no dice, right? And that's really good. And there's not really much that your opponent can do about it because it's not like you have to move the vehicle. It's not like Star Wars Legion where you have compulsory moves for repulsor lift vehicles, for example, right? And it's not like by shooting and wounding it, the model is physically removed like infantry are. Instead, it becomes a wreck. And the beauty about wrecks is that they're always hard cover. So now you could take a 14-point inexperienced Jeep, if you wanted to, for covering like a 2-man squad or a 3-man squad or a 4-man squad or something like that, because Americans now get a ton of those as of the armies of the US book. We might end up getting some things like that with the British book when it comes out. We'll soon see. But that means that, you've got these smaller squads who could go behind a 14-point soft cover vehicle, and shooting at it and removing it will admittedly give your opponent an order dice worth of kills, which could be a victory point, right? So, it's not nothing, but it's also now, bumped you up from a soft cover save to a hard cover save for free. You didn't have to pay for it, right? The only way they can really get it so that your cover transport is not providing cover for your troops is if they pin it. You attempt an order test, which is always your choice, right? You don't have to always attempt a run or advance action for this, and you fail, right? And in which case you would then reverse back and go down, right? So toward that end, the beauty about these transports is they are quite effective cover. They're especially good if you're running a cavalry or assault-oriented army where you know that you've got to step out and you got to go into it, especially if the middle part of the board is a little less covered than the far extremes of the board, because you will sometimes see that. It also means, and this is kind of the fun thing about it, if you have like a 14-point inexperienced Jeep, you can always run it right in front of your half-track vehicle or something else like that that's way more important, that is also a transport and has men in it, and you can now run the cover forward to make sure that at least the transport doesn't get destroyed nearly as easily. Because as long as it's blocking half or more of the vehicle from line of sight from whatever it is that's shooting at it, you give it cover, right? It doesn't have to be a higher armor value. It doesn't have to be taller. It doesn't even have to necessarily be wider. It's just got to cover half or more of the vehicle from the line of sight of the unit shooting at it. And because of that, you can take these to provide cover for literally anything, as long as they're not really, really tall tanks trying to hide behind really tiny Jeeps. You can get that, which is awesome. So what are the advantages of this? First of all, it is that cheap certainty, right? It's, again, a question of what do you actually want to worry about and what things do you want to have to wing on the fly? And some people are going to say, cover is not something I want to worry about. They're running a ton of mortars or they're running a lot of artillery. And so in their mind, they're like, well, I'm going to take a bunch of dirt cheap Jeeps so that my guys can still see over it for the purposes of drawing a line of sight. But people who are looking at us, 2 or 3 of the dudes in the squad, are going to be blocked by this. So that means we're getting cover on all of these guys. It's a relatively inexpensive buy in order to get things that you may not otherwise have. And worst case scenario, the beauty of those 3-man mortar teams, for example, is that if you really needed to, they can always just hop in the Jeep, right? And then you can move them up to a place where they'll be more effective, or maybe to where cover might be a little bit better, right? So like you have a lot of options for how you use that. Again, it helps to solve the unknown that comes with maps. It also means that in a recce platoon, you get a choice of cover or escape, right? So sometimes a cover transport might be actively providing cover, at which point we want it staying where it is. If we need to activate it, we'll give it a rally order, right? Or something like that. And then sometimes, though, the units that we were trying to guard might have already moved up to another location, and we're just kind of sitting there, and somebody thinks to themselves, hey, I'm just going to pick off this transport because that's just a free order dice. It could be worthwhile for you to pay an extra 10 points and put the recce rule on it. So that way, in that moment, you can say, nuh-uh, and escape and pull back behind other cover. And then when you need it again, you roll it right back up, and it does its job as cover. And again, we talked about this, but you get a free upgrade for damage value 6+ vehicles if they're destroyed. So that way they upgrade automatically from soft cover to heavy cover, which is always nice. The disadvantages, of course, are quite obvious. The first is that you're risking order dice, right? I mean, in a kill points mission, it is very dangerous having this approach to transports because you are likely taking these soft-skinned, or you're taking them as very cheap tractors, and they are very easy to remove, even if they're an armored tractor. They're very easy to remove. And that means kill points are going to stack up. And even if it helped you to keep this one unit safe and alive that's right behind it, as you see over here to the right, for example, with this M3 White Scout car helping to protect these dudes behind it, and they've got an officer over there just hanging out inside of the scout car. Like, if they do remove that, they're getting order dice, which is points, and that determines who wins. Similarly, it means that transport capacity points are wasted because you're not primarily using these for their transport capacity, right? If you could have something as big as a Landwasser Schlepper, but it only had transport capacity for 3, you'd be saving 17 points. 1 point for every capacity. It means there's a legitimate question of, hey, should I take this vehicle, which has a transport capacity of 3, or pay a few more points to get one with transport capacity of 6, but I'm only getting like an extra half an inch worth of vehicle off of it? I'd say forget it. Just go with the smaller one because you're going to save yourself quite a bit for an awful lot more value, right? It also means that early destruction of these can block units from moving to critical positions, right? Because again, it doesn't get removed from the table when it's destroyed. It's a wreck, which means now your men have to go around it. It's impassable terrain. If you were using them to provide cover for an armored vehicle, like a Stummel or some sort of a tank or something like that, where you were like, well, it's relatively light, a little bit fragile, so I want a little bit of extra protection for it. If the vehicle right in front of it gets blown up, now you've got to navigate and work around it. That could be problematic. You could lose a lot of effectiveness out of your much more expensive units that are sitting behind it, right? This also means that in general, this theory doesn't work quite as well in 3rd edition. Because instead of a -1 or -2 to hit like we had in 2nd edition, which was huge because it meant if you were in cover, especially mobile cover, you were talking 5s or 6s to hit you. Possibly worse than that. And if nowadays, they're still hitting you just fine. They're going to hit you on 4s, possibly 3s if they're using an AT gun firing at a vehicle that's behind one of these. And then they've got damage rolls, which is going to happen normally. And then from there, you're saving about a third to half of them, which anybody who's rolled these kinds of dice knows. I mean, that's swingy. Sometimes you get a lot of saves, sometimes you get none, sometimes it's right on the money, right? But either way, you're probably losing more than if, 60 to 80, 90% of their dice were missing, right? Off the top, and then rolling for damage, and then you had to suffer that. So in general, that's kind of the big drawback behind it, is that it is effective, but it's not nearly as effective as it was in 2nd edition. And then I guess the final question a lot of people might be asking is, time out. Why am I going to spend extra points on buying transports with an aim of using them for cover, instead of just doing what they did in World War II, which is you've got like, M4 Sherman tanks or whatever moving up, and the infantry just kind of walk in a column behind it, using the tank as cover, right? Like if I was planning on bringing an armored platoon anyway, and a lot of people do for very good reason in 3rd edition, why wouldn't I just crouch behind my T-34 or my Panzer III or my M4 Sherman, right? Or something like that. It's plenty big enough, right? I mean, it can block a lot of a squad from any reasonable, enemy shooting from a specific direction. It can save you a lot of points to just use your armor to do that. And then you don't have to worry about your armor being speed bumped by other stuff, right? So there are pluses and minuses to doing it this way, but I think it is a viable strategy as an approach, especially if you find you have like 30 points left over. So in terms of tactics, what kinds of things should we be looking at? First and foremost, transport capacity doesn't matter nearly as much as footprint. You want vehicles that are slightly larger, as a general rule. Now, you don't want to have to pay dramatic amounts of points to get them larger, but you might consider paying it, right? So for example, the difference between the Polski Fiat, little tiny civilian car, and the truck that you see over there, which is just an 8-man light truck, the difference between those two is about an inch. And the difference in cost is only about 4 points. That is probably a good trade. 12-man capacity truck going beyond that, since it only adds maybe another half an inch more, diminishing trades, but it still could be very useful. Figure out what is actually going to be helpful for you from a footprint perspective. That is the primary thing you should be considering, okay? The second thing to consider is armored versus soft-skinned, right? In the other things we've looked at, it really all depends. How much are you planning on getting shot at? That was all that really mattered. This one, it actually does matter a lot because the whole point is the level of cover that you're giving. So do you want to trust to a 5+ save, becoming a 6+ save in the case of the cavalry right there in the picture? Or is it worth it upgrading it and getting something that's heavier, right? So the Poles, for example, since we got some Polish Lancers over here hiding behind a Polish truck, right now they're getting a 6+ save. which is not a very good save. And, I've been maintaining this as far back as, Warhammer 40K 5th edition and many other games, Warhammer Fantasy Battles 8th edition, that a 6+ save is not a save. It's not, okay? You're not going to save very many dudes that way, and you're probably going to you'll be all gone by the time you end up getting anything out of it, right? So toward that end, I wouldn't really consider doing it that way. The Poles, for about 10 points more, can take an inexperienced armored half-track truck, which is about the same size. It only has transport capacity of 6, which is why you're not paying that many more points. But it's a damage value 7. So now it's starting as heavy cover, which becomes a 5+ save for these guys, which is twice as good as a 6+ save. And you only paid like an extra 10 points. Poles are pretty tight on points as a general rule. For anybody who thinks Poland's overpowered, I'm just going to tell you, from somebody who's built an awful lot of Polish lists, you'd be hard pressed to find 10 more points in most of the lists that you would like to run. But in this particular case, it could be worth it to do so. So, that's a consideration that you'll want to look at. Similarly, though, open top versus closed really doesn't matter. That's not something you really need to worry about because, again, we're not really putting dudes in these, right? Like, we hypothetically could put guys inside, in which case open top, meaning that you're going to be pinned by even small arms, is kind of a big deal. But not really when you're just using it for cover, because worst case scenario, you're just going to rally, right? You're going to move up to the position. They're going to start shooting at you. You're going to rally, in which case the pins that are on you really don't matter. And then you're going to shed a whole bunch of them. So that way, if on a future turn you want to move up and keep doing cover, you can. Otherwise, you just keep rallying, right, until you're done. And the guys that are behind you, you kind of serve as like a lily pad, right? Everybody's just kind of jumping right behind you, and then they jump onwards to where they need to go, right? You become the leapfrog. So honestly, I don't think open top, closed top really matters. So if you can save points by not making it closed top, I'd say save it. I don't think you necessarily need it. Okay. Do you need it to be mobile through rough terrain? Sometimes could be useful because, again, you don't really know the map. Of course, that same rough terrain very probably is giving cover, so you might just be able to end right next to it and kind of extend the cover that you're looking at. Okay. Does double movement on roads matter? It matters a lot if you're escorting cavalry or motorcycles or anything else like that where they are moving very fast. And so a 9-inch move is really not going to be an acceptable means of movement for moving with them. So having double movement on roads could be quite nice because then you can advance, which gives you a lot of pivots. We're going to talk about pivots a little bit later when we talk about the tactical side of things. But you want to have a lot of pivots. You definitely want to make sure you have one right there at the very end, which means you really don't want to be spending all your pivots just trying to move up into position. You want to make sure you leave it for optimization there at the end. And so having double movement on roads could be very useful. And then finally, veterancy. Honestly, I think you take these inexperienced because, again, all you're going to do is you're going to activate once, move up to where you need to go, and that's probably going to be enough, to be completely honest. So from that point on, it's just going to be rally actions, and then you just hope that you pass, right? If you need to, you keep an officer nearby but not in it, so that way he isn't being pinned as well. And then that way you're getting that +2 morale bonus, and you just keep rallying, right? And I think that could work out really well. So save yourself some points because, again, we're throwing something into the fire here, and so we don't want to risk too much in terms of the investment in it. But that's one thing that you could do just to help save yourself some points. So in terms of tactics, how do we actually do this? So the first consideration we have is that we're going to be deploying the cover transport. Now, for our purposes here, in the center of the screen, you can see our cover transport. This is an M3A1 half-track. We, of course, have the heavy machine gun on the 360 firing ring, which is always nice. And we decided to buy the right side pintle-mounted machine gun that can only fire to the right side. We did not buy the left one, and there's a reason for that. Okay, we have an officer situated inside of the transport because he's going to be needed in order to fire the machine gun. And then we're also got a 7-man rifle section with 1 Browning automatic rifle and 6 rifles that are located right next to it. Okay, and this is the unit that we're going to be protecting with the transport. You can see our Russian doll / clown car unit over there on the far left-hand side. And of course, up there, you've got the Stug that's straight ahead. That's one of our concerns. We've got a machine gun team in the top left building that's looking out over the shots from here with the windows. We got to be careful of that. And then, of course, we've got that Hanomag in the top right corner that's got the engineering unit, the Pioneers with the flamethrower, submachine guns, and an officer. Okay, so these are the things we're thinking about. So the first thing we do when we're considering where we place this is we want to deploy it either out of line of sight or as cover as early as turn 1. Now, in this case, there really wasn't a whole lot of good line of sight places, out of line of sight that we really wanted to use, especially on something that only gets a 9-inch move because it's a half track, right? And so we want to be careful on all of that and as to how we're going about doing the movements. But in this case, it's getting really good cover from the Stug. It's completely out of line of sight of the machine gun. It's mostly out of line of sight of the Hanamag, and the Hanamag, in order to actually take shots at it, would need to pivot and turn to get to us, which is generally a good sign because that means they're probably not going to hit very well. It's going to be fives. Fives with 4 shots is not that great. And even if they do, it's just going to be a pin, right? There's nothing dangerous that's going to happen. Okay. We're going to make sure that it has a path. In this case, the path is going to be straightforward. Our thinking is that there's that large gap area between the buildings that's right ahead of this unit. And what we want is we want an easy way to be able to approach their softer units and to be able to potentially counterattack against the engineers once we know that they pop out and try going after our tanks on the further right-hand side of the board. In general, for these kinds of units, I would not recommend buying a transport with recce as a general rule. Even if you could take it in a recce platoon, I probably wouldn't, just because we want to keep it cheap. We want to make sure that it's staying in the way of shots. And recce has a way of complicating both of those, both because it's adding cost to the unit, as well as if you perform an escape maneuver, the escape maneuver is probably not providing cover for your other men. Very probably. Okay, so it's kind of going against the whole strategy of the cover transport. Okay, there's a few niche cases, which we'll talk about later, as to why you might consider that. But in general, just don't buy recce. Okay. The next thing is we want to plan the locations first, and then we deploy before the cover unit just to make sure that we've got the spacing right. So you can technically deploy it early, you can deploy it late, because again, it's mostly situated around the board. And if you put down a transport in a certain place, your opponent is immediately thinking, transport. He's going to move men up that way, right? What they're probably not thinking about is we're not doing this for a fast rush. We're doing this for a protected rush, right? And so because of that, they may make plans sitting back, waiting for you to come around a corner, and then you kind of come around a corner. But what you're really doing is you're making sure that your men can pop out a little bit more beyond that corner and still be safe, right? In terms of placing them in reserves, don't do this. The whole point of this transport is to provide cover for your units if they aren't coming in on turn 2 until turn 2, possibly later if you botch the reserves check. Then you're not doing what this thing is made for. So I would just skip on that. Don't put it in reserves. Similarly, don't outflank this unit. The whole point of it is to be covered. And if you're not being covered for the first 2 turns, you've wasted a third of the game and over a third of your time limit probably. And you haven't done anything with the unit that you spent points on. So I would say deploy them down. Worst case scenario, you're setting the stage for other stuff. Then comes the rush. So what we do when you're doing it, there's the question of do you run or do you advance? In this case, with the cover transport, you almost always want to advance. And the reason why you want to advance is not because you have guns on you. This one happens to, and we'll explain why we chose, you can see even from here, why we put the gun only on the right-hand side. The reason why is because when we're performing our pivots, we want to make sure that we have the facings right so that we can maximize that gunfire, okay? But what we're actually doing is we're maximizing the amount of cover that we're giving, right? We're lengthening it because instead of shooting at us head on, they're shooting at us from the side. And side armor provides just the same level of cover as the frontal armor when it comes to transports and stuff like that. So in that sense, for the guys that are right behind it, they don't mind if the wall is a little bit longer, okay? So the question primarily is, what are you trying to cover, and can you keep pace, right? Can you make it so that you can actually get where you need to go, and that you can actually cover the boys when they're moving up, okay? Pivots. You want to leave a pivot for the very end, and the reason why is because, 1, we want to lengthen it, but 2, because it allows you to set up for things depending on the kind of vehicle that you take, right? So in this case, the M3A1 is set up so that it can fire its heavy machine gun and its machine gun downrange. We could fire them both at the Hanamag, which would be fine. I think realistically, you'd want to fire the machine gun at the Hanamag. You'd want to fire the heavy machine gun at the Stug with the full knowledge that you're going to be giving heavy cover to the Stug. But you would want to perform that shot because you might pin it. And a pin is helpful, right? Regardless of what else we do, there's a non-zero chance that he's not going to pass what he should be passing, right? And so unless he's veteran, which this Stug in particular is not, as to how I built it out. But regardless of what's going to happen, you've now got shots, right, that are ready to roll. Throw them where you want to go, and you're still providing cover against the enemy. Spacing. This is a really critical one. While turning sideways is a really good idea because you can always end your move with that last 90-degree pivot, make sure if you're in a road, hallway, any sort of alleyway or thing like that where it's a relatively tight spot, make sure that when you finish your pivot, there's still room for the unit that's hiding behind you to be able to get around you. And the reason why is because if you turn into a wreck and you now become impassable terrain that is admittedly still heavy cover, your men won't be able to move over it. They won't be able to move through it. And that could be really problematic. It could really speed bump you. So don't become your own roadblock. Provide cover, which only has to cover half or more of the unit. Provide cover, but don't block your exit. Okay, you're going to need that. And then finally, of course, in terms of spacing, make sure that you can get around. And then for your officer snap twos, you can snap to the transport and any sort of cover unit that's going with you. Officers are generally a good idea to bring with these. If for no other reason, then again, when the cover is there, we want the cover to do its job. And when it needs to rally, we don't want it to fail, right? So you can include an officer here. I think out of all the ones we've talked about so far, the officer probably least necessary as regards this approach because again, worst case scenario, it's just sitting there and it might even get just blown up and people shoot at it. So, it's not going to make a dramatic difference, right? As to whether you bring it. But if you want to maximize and really get the most out of these, an officer can be helpful. And then in terms of dropping off the passengers, honestly, this is the funny part. You rarely do, right? You're helping the guys to move up because they feel like they can run further and they don't have to cut their movement short in order to, in order to take advantage of cover because you are ideally going ahead of them and providing them with cover all the way up to their 12-inch move, right? In this case, the guys that moved up last turn, this is kind of 2 turns in, so you can see the Honda Mag is now moved and stuff like that. The point of this transport, the M3A1, was to provide a rolling offense. So, they were moving up and then shooting down range, and then the BAR took a shot from the squad and also shot at the Honda Mag just to try to apply more pins to it. And now the Honda Mag has moved up and dropped the engineers. The engineers are attacking the M3 Lee, which was attacking the Stug. And now, at the beginning of the next turn, we activate the M3A1 with the officer. We also snap to the unit that's just behind it, and they move up again, this time providing additional cover and supporting fire. So now the HMG can continue firing at the Stug. The MMG can continue firing at the Honda Mag just to help to tie it down. And then you've got an infantry section that's moved up to start shooting at the Honda Mag as well, right? Or possibly even just the officer that jumped out and is hiding in those ruins, right? So, as you're doing it, the focus is on covering your buddies, right? It's moving up with full knowledge of, hey, are they intending to advance only 6 inches and shoot this turn? Okay, then I don't have to move 12 inches up. I don't have to move 18 inches up. I'm going to move up like 9 or 8, 8 to 9 inches, make sure that I'm providing cover while still being up far enough that I can easily pivot out, move up to where I need to go next, pivot again, and prepare to shoot again, right? In order to provide them with cover and make sure that they have cover against incoming attacks as well. Facing, of course, very important. That pivot is going to make a big difference for how you do your facing. Just remember, if you did take guns on this thing, the facing also has to work for your guns because you paid points for those, okay? Cover, are you trying to cover the transport or are you just extending cover, right? So in this case, the M3A1 had to ask an important question, which is, do I want to end my move so that I'm more behind the building to protect me from the Stug? And the answer that this general decided was no. I'm just here to extend the heavy cover of the building to make sure that the squad is safe, especially in case that Stug decides to move up and try to get to point blank range. I want to make sure that I'm giving them a really, really good save. And so he's exposing himself intentionally on the side, which for a Stug with a heavy AT gun is a really good day. Okay, so toward that end, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked about final positioning and whether or not you even need to give cover to the transport once it's in position. And then finally, for objectives, there's a couple of different ways to think of this. The first is when you're moving up to an objective, your cover transport could overshoot the objective. You could actually shoot beyond it if you needed to and start firing at people if you needed. But the thinking being is now we're providing cover on the far side of the objective so that when we take it, we've already got our cover in place to protect us from enemies retaliating and trying to wipe out our unit that's claiming the objective, right? The alternative option is you could just breach into the realm that would contest the objective. So that way, when a unit moves up and moves right behind you, they are within range to score, but they also still have a bit of cover, right? But they're not deep in, so that way it's a little harder for the enemy to retaliate with more units. The angles are generally going to be better, but it helps to keep you a little bit more safe. And then finally, the question of, so at what point should you retreat the transport? I'm not going to lie, basically never. And again, this plays into the whole, it's not safe doing it this way. You are risking order dice when you do this. But you're primarily going to stand and fight if you have guns, or you're going to stand and not fight because you're supposed to be cover, right? You're just going to take the shots. And that's the whole point of taking this vehicle and why we often want to take it as cheap as possible, okay? You want to allow for a fade through, as we talked about. The other unit should be able to move past it, right? You want to make sure that you've given some room. Lateral retreats can be used, but that's mostly once the threat that you were covering against has been removed or has retreated. then you would then laterally move to support a different area of the battlefield by becoming cover for other guys that are over there on the front and going to the dangerous spots. Okay. And then as regards to picking up a second load, so you move up your cover and then you fall back and then you provide cover for somebody else, or you actually physically bring up a group of guys, you're basically never going to do this. You just don't have time because you were probably cover for at least 1 to 2 turns. So now we're at this point, we're already on turn 3 at least. By the time you get back to get to other people who would need you to potentially pick them up or potentially provide them with cover, you're already heading into turn 4. And then you might be, it could even be turn 5 or turn 6 before you're really seeing value from it. I just think it's generally better. You're probably not going to be able to use it in that many parts of the battlefield. You're certainly not going to be able to use it for actually providing transport for people. Okay. And so that is the cover theory. It is intentionally putting these transports in danger, but it is a relatively cheap way to fix an unknown. And that can be very, very useful. The next one that we're going to be talking about is still going to involve wheels and it's going to involve things moving very fast, but it isn't going to involve any transports. And that's because as we look at the faux transport theory, we're going to be taking a look at infantry sections and bonuses and benefits that they can purchase as upgrades to themselves that improve their speed and mobility. And so if you've enjoyed this series, please let us know down below if there are thoughts that you have on the cover transport. Do tracked transports that can't take advantage of double movement on roads, are they actually useful for use just as cover? Obviously, people love Brens, but are they actually useful just within the context of providing cover for troops? Have I been a little too hard-handed on larger capacity ones for paying extra points when the footprint maybe is much larger than you would otherwise get on something that has 4 to 6 less seats? Let us know down in the comments below, and we will see you next time.